Next up, we have two presenters, both from Quint Wellington Redwood. Alex Vanderberg is a partner there. Sylvia Nordhausen is a principal consultant. Both have over 20 years' experience in the industry. So I'd like to invite you guys to come onto the stage and take it away.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. I'm Alex. Very happy to be here. We're from Quint Wellington Redwood Sourcing Advisory. We've been engaged with IAOP for ages, and it's always wonderful to be here, either at OWS in the US or EOS in Europe. So thanks for having us. We'll be sharing some of our experiences this morning, and also an uncomfortable amount of IP. Just kidding. So, and as a policy, you know, I'm not allowed to be the only speaker on stage. My boss, our CEO, won't allow it. So, Silva's here to help me out on content perspective. He's one of the most senior guys in the team who's actually worked on some of the products and projects we'll be talking about. So, it is about advanced sourcing of Agile and DevOps. So just wanted to do a very quick check here in the room. So it's about IT and application development and maintenance and stuff like that. So just wanted to do a check in the room. Who in this room, in their organization, or if you're a sourcing advisor at your clients, is working in, has been working or is working in Agile software development or DevOps? Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about that and how it kind of relates to outsourcing and traditional outsourcing and new ways of sourcing. So I'll hand over to Silva for the first slide, and you have the controller, which is great.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Alex, for this introduction. So it's up to me to try to make the thing work today. Yeah, it does. Okay, so here's a brief introduction of the contents. So I'm happy to see that you support our conclusion, which I will share some more of, that Agile and DevOps are some key trends in Europe today. Almost everyone raised their hands, so that's good to see. So this trend, of course, also raises the question, as we are also on an outsourcing summit, is that compatible with the traditional outsourcing models? And we found some issues in practice with our clients, with our models, that needed to be solved. Because the typical way of paying for the delivered work, which is normally T&M, time and material, so you pay per hour but not so much per result, and function point analysis, where you make a very big analysis before you actually do the work, so you lose quite a bit of time, which does not really comply with the Agile philosophy. Those traditional ways of doing business, if you like, they actually, they pose some challenges in practice. So we tried to find some new sourcing models to improve these shortcomings. And we would like to share with you today two of our models which we have developed together, which we have also applied at customers. And I think they will provide an interesting new view on how we can solve these shortcomings. Of course, that's kind of a lesson learned process, right? Because that's new development. So we also have some lessons learned to share, and we'd also like to show you how to apply. And of course, we have, as usual, room for Q&A. So to start with first. Yes. There we go. So Agile and DevOps are key trends in Europe today, and what we see is that according to our yearly research, we do a yearly survey, which is with 250 CIOs or direct reports to CIOs. This is something we do every year to look into trends, opinions, etc. And you see that DevOps and Agile are two of the main trends. Actually, the number one and the number three developments which keep the CIOs awake, as we called it. That's almost literally the question we asked. What are the things that keep you awake at night? Well, these are two of them. So the actual implementation of Agile and DevOps is something which, is on top of mind for many of the CIOs, and I'm happy to support, to see the numbers at least supported. Yes. So I think I should put some coffee in this thing. Anyway, so the second question, of course, is next to the trends which we see, how do you evaluate the adoption of these trends at client organizations? So you either see that they are green, which means that they are reasonably on the way to be installed, at least implemented, to be part of the daily operations of the company. Or it's yellow, which means that they are kind of trying to implement, and you see that with Agile it's progressing quite well, which is, I think, something we can all support. DevOps not so much yet, and that's often a stage after, of course, you implement the Agile way of working. So you see that the actual adaptation is a bit less, but you also see that 64% of organizations are trying to make some sense of it and trying to implement it into their daily operations. So you see that there's quite a bit of development in these trends. Question? Yes, Arjan.
So the question is this Agile in name only, or is it actually being implemented? So to be honest, in the research, we're not able to check 250 organizations and make sure, well, we'd love to do it, but they'll have to pay us. So we didn't check that. So you're probably right. There's a lot of organizations that have the ambition to work in Agile and are somewhere halfway there that might still give a green answer here. So I think probably on the right side, the green numbers are a little less than they're portrayed. That is probably a fair statement. Having said that, I think the perception is that DevOps and Agile and cloud as well, but we're talking today about DevOps and Agile, are really important. And the truth is, at least on Agile, people are moving. And on DevOps, people are trying to move. So it's something that is upon us. But you're right. I think the maturity is very different in many organizations. Yes. So the question is people mixing up DevOps and Agile as a terminology. So we see most of the organizations that we work with work pretty well in Agile. And then they feel DevOps is the next big thing to, be part of. So for us, the difference is Agile is about development only. It's a bit of a black and white statement. And DevOps is introducing the maintenance and operations of software into the team. So we see a lot of organizations doing Agile. And some of the organizations that do Agile say they're also doing DevOps, but they're not really doing it yet. So this is true. There's a bit of a mix-up going on.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges which you have when you have a kind of traditional development organization, right? Because you would have a change organization, you would have a run organization, and traditionally they might be kind of separated. And what we often see is that you try to kind of reform the Agile part into the development, the organization that you make Agile, so it's more with short cycles, quicker development, quicker releases, etc. But the actual operations part, so the run part, still remains the same. So that's quite often where the mixing up comes from. So the question which many of our clients have is, what do we do with the traditional run department, which is used to, getting a really big release and doing it like every 2 months, every 3 months. Whereas on the other side, on the development part, you have very short cycle development, so maybe every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks or maybe even quicker. And mixing that is difficult. So you have to find a balance between those two. And I think that's also part of the problem with DevOps, that the transition on the maintenance side, on the actual run side, for many organizations is really difficult to make. And part of that, I think, is because it also requires different competencies, different people, perhaps. And, of course, you have things like automation of testing and that kind of stuff, which also makes sure that you have maybe less demand for the actual traditional run tasks. So it's often in people and it's in way of working.
I think the step from traditional to Agile is maybe smaller than from Agile to DevOps, even though people think they're already there.
But at least, as the research shows, it's keeping everyone quite busy, so that's good to see. That's yours, Alex.
Thanks. So, okay, so that is just setting the stage here of the, let's say, importance of Agile and DevOps, or at least the fact that it's something that's happening in the market. So I want to point out a couple of things. So I've been, as many of you, and Silva as well, many of us have been in the outsourcing business for more than 5 years, more than 10 years, more than 20 years. So we know the traditional outsourcing business quite well, right? And then now this relatively new phenomenon of Agile and DevOps is coming, and it has a philosophy that is incompatible with the traditional way of outsourcing that we've been doing for 20 years. Now, when I say traditional, it's not a bad thing. I'm a very traditional guy, you know? It's not, I don't mean traditional, I don't mean old-fashioned. It's just the way we did it. And it's not, and it's been evolving, it's been maturing, and it's been quite effective for us for the last 20 years. But I want to point out some incompatibilities. So, traditional outsourcing is about, so let me give you an example in software development, is about a standard measure. For instance, Silva was mentioning function points. So you want to have a measure of the productivity of your provider, if you're a buyer, and you say, look, give me 1,000 function points, and I would typically pay X amount of money for it, or I'll give you, X amount of months to create it. And the teams you put on my project, they all have to perform to a certain productivity level that I explain in for instance, in one standard measure, so it could be function points or something else. Now the problem is that the philosophy of Agile and DevOps is that each team has its own productivity. So you're probably familiar with the term velocity, which is a measurement that measures the productivity of an Agile software development team. But you cannot say the velocity in one team is 10. You cannot compare that to another team because the team works on different software, etc. So traditional outsourcing, we work with one standard measure, but in Agile and DevOps, multiple teams, every team is measuring velocity, but you can't compare them. So how do we measure productivity when outsourcing Agile and DevOps? Next, incompatibility. In traditional outsourcing, we say functionality determines effort. So when I'm pointing out incompatibilities, I'm being a bit black and white, so I hope you forgive me. But traditional thinking is, we specify what we want. Again, software development example, we specify what we want, we create a functional design or whatever, and then based on that design, we determine how big the team is, how much time we need. While in Agile and DevOps, it's the other way around. We say we have 1 or 2 or 3 or 100 teams, and we throw functionality at it, and depending on the size and effort the team brings in, the functionality is determined. So it's the other way around. Let me give you another one. So the question here is, before I skip to the next one, is what effort should we plan when outsourcing in an Agile and DevOps way? Do we need 100 teams? Do we need 200 teams? Do we need 5 teams? Do we need them for 1 year, for 3 sprints, etc.? Next one. Traditional outsourcing is about KPIs, SLAs, etc. And they're great. They've been serving us, and it's important to have some kind of, transparent way that everybody agrees on about how the system is performing or whatever. But the philosophy of Agile and DevOps is empowered teams, like Arjan was mentioning, and other speakers as well. Empowered teams that shouldn't be burdened too much with KPIs. So we'll tell you in a minute how we can solve this. I don't think you should go to a 0 KPI model, but you shouldn't bother a team that has sprints of 2 or 3 weeks with 15 KPIs, because they'll spend 1 day in the sprint just, reporting on 15 KPIs, and it's not putting the professionals in their power. So, but we still need to retain some amount of control, because if you outsource it and you just say, provider, go ahead, do your best, That's not going to work either. Last, incompatibility. Traditional outsourcing is about the separation of responsibilities. There's a service catalog that says, you know, I do this, you, supplier, you do that. And if I don't specify my functionality good enough, you can challenge me on that. And if you don't create the software that is compatible with the specifications, I can challenge you on that. So it's not a bad thing, it's just the way we've organized it and the way it needs to work. But the philosophy of Agile and DevOps is the team may include people from the client, perhaps a product owner, a Scrum Master, in Agile examples, or maybe a development ops engineer from the client that owns the production environment, and maybe some developers from a supplier. So you cannot create a separation of responsibilities in an Agile team because it goes against the fact that the team as a whole is responsible for the result. So how can I show it's still the vendor's fault? Which is, I think, is a key principle of, no, just kidding. But at the end of the day, all the vendors know this is true. But at the end of the day, you want some accountability. You need to have something there. You cannot just let it all go. So these are some of the incompatibilities we see. So we've shown you and you've kind of, by raising your hand, kind of agreed to the fact that Agile and DevOps are upon us. And you see you have a couple of things that in essence are incompatible with the traditional way we do sourcing. So I'll hand back to Silver for the next.
Thank you, sir.
To give us, so I've stated the problem, now he can give you the solution, hopefully.
Well, thank you for raising the bar. Well, anyway. Okay, so the traditional ways of managing output and outcome and the contracts are T&M or function points. So let me just share with you a story from a client. He actually wanted Agile, and he was going to ask for a strategic partner supporting him in Agile. So basically what they did was to say, well, you know, here's $500,000 or euros or whichever it was. Dear vendor, we want Agile developers, please give us a lot of teams. So the contract was actually, here's literally $500,000. We want some teams, please develop in .NET and some other technologies our functionality. There was a list of functionality and we're good to go. Any thoughts on what could go wrong here? Anyone? Sorry? Yep, absolutely. Anyone else?
Scope requirements was mentioned, yeah, which is a valid point. People will just start programming and stop when the budget's done.
Oh, yeah?
Collaboration with the customer. We need time from the customer to get all the information you want.
Change request,
Yep.
yeah. So customer involvement, change request, you know, the scope changes along the time, which is terrible if you have a fixed budget, etc., etc.
Yes, well, there's a long list of things that could go wrong, and we've seen them go wrong, but two of the things I want to highlight are, the first interesting effect was that suddenly every single development of functionality was called Agile. So every project, like someone had a kind of stamp, you know, went to the product list and went Agile, 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 everything suddenly is Agile. So the list of things to do within the contract was enormous. The second was that they just started developing, right? Because there's no real connection between, as Alex already said, the actual teams and the output. So they just started developing, and the customer said, well, the only thing I'm really certain about is that it's going to cost me $500,000. But I have no idea what the delivery is. I don't know how much, I don't know exactly what, I don't know when. So this was quite difficult, and this was a typical example of a T&M contract. But what you see there is that it doesn't actually help you to perform better, to push innovation, to push outcome.
And to
Because
be
it's
fair,
simply just spending money, basically.
you can use time and materials to work in an Agile and DevOps mode. It's not a problem. You can agree on the rate and still manage it in a proper way. It's possible.
Yeah.
It will work. But we feel because it doesn't stimulate the vendor to overperform, we think as an industry we can do a little better. We can put something in there without messing up the Agile and DevOps philosophy that still allows us to move a bit beyond time and materials. So we'll touch upon that in a couple of minutes.
So the second usual way of measuring is using function points. Anyone experienced with function points? And what's the problem with function points?
One function point is not another.
One function point is not another is a problem with function points, true. You know what I don't like about function points? You need to count them. It's just it's a lot of effort and it's not a lot of fun. And like you were saying this morning, Arjen, the fun is part of, getting people motivated. And people are not very motivated in my experience if they have to count how many screens are being made and how much function points that is. So,
well, actually, I do know one person who likes function points, but she's a function point analysis and she gets paid in TNM. So,
yeah.
What can you say, right? So the problem with function points, if you look at an Agile development environment, is of course that it takes a lot of time to count, to analyze, right? And often it takes as much time to actually analyze the content of a sprint as in doing the sprint. So you basically double your time. You have a lot of cost because it's not cheap. Good function point analysts are not cheap usually. So it slows you down because it takes a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of money, and it's not very motivating because, as Alex rightly said, it's quite boring to do, to be honest. So the whole concept of short cycles, agile, quick developments, just go and do it, it's a bit blocked by these problems. So those are the pitfalls of the more traditional way of outsourcing. So if the button works, well, yes. Conclusion, we need a different sourcing model, which takes away these risks. So we have developed, and here's where the fun part starts. 2 new models, and one of them is called the Continuous Improvement Sourcing, or CIS, which means that we focus basically on pushing the teams to deliver better quality within the same amount of time. So that's very much quality innovation focused. And the second model is called the Advanced Output Sizing. And that means that even though we try to work agile and even though we want to kind of, have a flexible scope, etc., we still try to measure the amount of work done and also connect the payments to the amount of work done, because that's one of the biggest complaints of our customers. We do not know how much work we are actually paying for. So we've tried to come up with some models to solve these problems. So the first model doesn't just focus on functionality or time, but on continuous team improvement. I think there's a nice link to Arjan's presentation this morning. It is in the end about teams and the performance of teams, and the quality is of course associated with that. Right, so what this model does is to provide a way basically for the teams to grow gradually, and also there's a balance, if you like, between the reward for the vendors and the way it is actually paid for. So you see that there's more room for error, if you like, if I can put it so bluntly, Alex, at the front, so there's less risk. So by improving quality, you reduce the risk, but you also make sure that the vendor knows better what is expected of them. The second model doesn't focus on FPA, so no function points, but still looks at typical units of functionality or software. So the question you're probably going to ask is, okay, so if we still use units, isn't that the same as function points? The answer is no, because what we say here is that we use typical types of work, if you like, such as changing a button, implementing a piece of text in a website, that kind of examples. And the examples are leading to define typical units. And of course, the units then have a price. So it's easier to measure without having to do a big analysis up front.
So what you see, oh, please, go ahead.
In the first case, how do you price
Hold on for 1 minute. We will dive into both models in more detail.
Yeah.
And we will tell you how it's priced and how it's sized, etc. We will also tell you about the collaboration. So you could say, we said before, you can still do it time material if you want. It's no problem. You can do it time material if you steer it correctly. It will work. But as we all know, time material is not a very satisfying sourcing model to contract your provider with. So these are two ways to bring it in without messing up the Agile and DevOps philosophy.
Are the organizations which are sourcing are equipped to handle these models?
Not all client organizations. Very good. So the question is, are the organizations that use these models equipped to do it? Not all organizations are. So we will actually later in the presentation also touch upon some of the properties that a client must have to apply these models, because we call them advanced models because we're very proud of them, but also because they're quite, they require a high maturity in Agile and DevOps. If you're not on that high maturity level, stick with T&M.
Alex, could you also, in the deep dive, connect to the governance issue? What's the difference in governance?
Well, yes, I think we can, although, John, you need to manage our time a little bit here. And to be fair, so we've applied this maybe 15 times. So this is relatively new stuff, right? 2 years ago, this didn't exist, but okay. So what I'll do, I'll dive into model 1, the continuous improvement. It's a very complicated picture because we're consultants. We love to create complicated pictures, but I will guide you through it. It is really not that complicated. But the idea is, so this is the time here on the horizontal axis. So let's say this is an Agile team. Let's keep it simple. Let's not do DevOps right now. But let's say this is an Agile team. There's a number of sprints that the team goes through. So let's assume the team is mostly staffed with professionals from a service provider. But let's assume the product owner is a person from the customer side, and let's assume there's maybe 1 or 2 developers or operators. I'm now making it DevOps. Well, anyways, that the minority of the team and the product owner is from client side. I think most of the time it makes a lot of sense that the product owner is from the client, right? So what the team will go through, so the team will start at some moment. They will either start in working Agile or they'll start in a relationship because a contract is signed. So as part of the Agile philosophy, they'll create a product vision. They'll establish something that they think is a minimal viable product, something they'll deliver in a couple of sprints. And they will establish a backlog of functionality that needs to be created. Now the first couple of sprints, so this is an example, let's take 3 sprints, they'll just do time and material. So the provider and the client have agreed a rate card, very simple, and the client will have kind of vouched the members of the team, because that's what you do. If you agree on a rate card, you also want to vouch for the people that you hire for that rate. You'll check them. And for a couple of sprints, they will work like that. So that's the baseline, 100% T&M, no KPIs. Let's not burden the team. Let's just make sure they'll do some code checks as part of their CI/CD pipeline or whatever, or their Jira, and they'll of course measure velocity. But there won't be, those measurements will be made, but there's no penalty. There's no, reward or penalty based on that. Now, at some point, you have, and this example is 3 sprints, but it could also be 6 sprints. So in this example, this is an actual client example where a sprint is 1 month, just to get the numbers right. Because if the sprint is 2 weeks, probably 3 sprints is not enough. You need a couple of months to go through this model. Then you've established that backlog, and you've established a baseline velocity of that team. Because you cannot compare velocity between teams, but you can compare velocity in one team between sprints, right? You can say this sprint we were more productive or less productive than last sprint. And you have a customer satisfaction on that team. So the customer could be the product owner as part of the team, or it could be some people behind the product owner, so to say. So once that is there, there's a baseline. Now for the next phase, sprints 3 to N, we agree that that baseline needs to be met, that standard. So let's say the customer satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10 is a 7. It's not bad, eh? Pretty good, especially in the Netherlands. Getting a 7 is really good. Anyways, let's assume it's a 7. And let's assume the velocity is X for that team. Then we say for the next couple of sprints, the customer satisfaction needs to stay at a 7 and the velocity needs to stay at X. And if you improve the velocity and the customer satisfaction, we will reward both the team and the provider. This is very tricky because the question was, I think it was your question, about which clients can do this. Procurement department goes crazy. We pay them more than the rate card. We cannot, there's no way we can do it. So then you cannot apply this model. Because the idea is, if the team indeed moves beyond velocity X and beyond customer satisfaction 7, so let's say they go to an 8 and they go to X plus 10%, we will pay the provider a certain extra amount of money, let's say 5%, 2%, something like that. And also for the team, we will create a investment fund or a small budget where they can do something with. They can, for instance, at some point when they have a certain amount of budget there, they can go to a conference together. I'm talking about the supplier persons as well as the client persons together to a conference or drink beer, whatever. But if they do not make the X productivity velocity or the 7 customer satisfaction, there will be a penalty which could be deducted from either of these funds. So again, this requires, so why would the customer pay more? Because the customer gets more value. And how does the customer know he gets more value? Because the product owner tells him. But what if he doesn't trust the product owner? He shouldn't be trying to go to Agile. Just stick to traditional models. It's worked for us for 20 years. But I want to be Agile. Then you need to trust your product owner. The definition of value is the velocity plus the customer satisfaction. If you don't agree with that, don't work in Agile. So, last thing about this model. If you have worked, if you're here after a couple of sprints, let's say 3 sprints, if you're again in a 1-month sprint, let's say the team establishes at this point a customer satisfaction of 7 and a velocity of X. Now for 3 sprints in a row, they create a customer satisfaction of a 8 and a velocity of X plus 10%. 3 sprints in a row, which means the team and the vendor both get rewarded 3 sprints in a row. Then we say, okay, wonderfully done, but this is now the new baseline. Because apparently you have improved productivity, which means you will not be rewarded again for the next 3 sprints, but this will be the new baseline. If you stay to that baseline, there's no problem. We will continue. If you don't hit the baseline, we might move back. And if we feel at some point we're below that baseline for 3 or 4 sprints, we will adjust the baseline. But we will have a conversation with you, because what happened? Is it the product owner? Is it the team, etc.? So that's the model of continuous improvement sourcing that we've applied. Questions? In the back.
How do you ensure that customer satisfaction is transparent and clearly measured?
Yes. So it's a very good question. So how do you ensure that the customer satisfaction is transparent and clearly measured? So we define customer satisfaction. It depends on the situation, but it's a consulting answer. It always depends. But we typically would measure the customer satisfaction is just the product owner and 1 or 2 key persons behind the product owner from the business. That is the definition of customer satisfaction, and they need to fill in a report grade. Now your next question will be, yes, but what if they're grumpy? Or what if are you on booze and go too high? If that is the case, there's something wrong with these people. So we're not going to go into models that we are going to have external auditors determine what the quality is. We're not going to, because it burdens the team with too many KPIs. So this is it. And so if the customer says, you know what, Alex, I don't trust that model, then I respect that. And I say, look, it's no problem. You can stick to T&M, or you can go to traditional outsourcing, whatever you like. But if you really want to go Agile and DevOps, you need to trust your product owner and the 2 or 3 key players behind. John.
Question. It works only when you have a stable team.
Yes.
So.
Very good question.
What do you do when you have, especially when you have a hybrid team?
Yeah.
When you have changes in your team, because that's in fact immediately your velocity.
Yes, so the question is, what do you do if your team isn't stable? A very good question. You do nothing. Because the team really wants to be stable. The provider really wants the team to be stable. So if the provider is not able to handle attrition, performance will drop and there will be a penalty. Because we don't care. It has to be solved. The team needs to solve the attrition. Correct. Correct. That also means that's why the team will get the. So it's not, you cannot blame it all on the provider, correct? Yeah. So this is the negative story. If punishment is being dealt out, everybody gets punished, not just the provider. The provider gets punished because he doesn't get his extra money. The team gets punished because they lose some of their budget to drink beer, go to conferences. But the client is also punished because he gets less value. So everyone is punished.
It needs some level of maturity.
That's correct. So that was previously also mentioned, you need a level of maturity in Agile and DevOps. If you don't have that level of maturity, stick to T&M.
So, about 15 use cases.
Correct.
We have really high productivity, and you come back at times. How often do you see that? Because my experience is I have a similar model with incentives based in.
Right.
But every other quarter, the suppliers come back and say, well, we have an issue, and they go back and saying, oh, we'll do the basics.
So we see there is no, at some point a team stabilizes. So you cannot ask a team to go from customer satisfaction 7 to 8 to 9 to 10, then it's done. And there will be dips. So what we do 2 things. So there's no easy solution to it. So we do 2 things. We explain that you cannot expect a team to let's say, significantly improve all the time, every time. And so that is just mind setting. What we want is to have the first half year to have some improvement. But after that, stable is good. And it will be a measurement, indeed, like what was being said, to ensure that the team stays stable. But if there's a dip, what we do is we measure over a couple of sprints, because one dip in one sprint should not be a thing. So we take 3 or 4 sprints depending on the size of the sprint. But let's say a quarterly measurement. So that's what we do. So we're a bit short on time. I want to give Silva some time to explain a different approach that you could also consider. Wonderful.
Right, so one more thing to mention, perhaps on the previous slide, is also that, of course, if the team starts interacting in a very negative way, if they start killing each other, then of course there's some way of escalating that, right? So there's always someone kind of supervising that in the contract. So the second model is the output sizing. So this was a situation which I just mentioned, actually, where you have a 500,000 contract. Let's not move too close to that speaker. This client, actually, for which we developed it first, he said, well, I'm spending 500,000. 5 minutes, all right, thanks, I'll have to speed up. So the client said, well, I'm spending all this money, and I'm not sure what happens, right? It's costing me a lot of money, that's the only thing I'm sure of. So he said, well, you know, if they spend half their day talking and not developing, I'm still paying for that because it's T&M. So, you know, I want to have some kind of model without having to have an enormous amount of administration so that I can actually pay for what I really get. So that was the question there. And the reason was to have a better control of the results in comparison with the costs. So, of course, there's some kind of professionalism there, but he wanted to have this measured. So what we needed was some way of sizing without going into complex systems like function point analysis, and also avoiding the TNM, because this client was literally getting totally allergic to TNM. And I remember him actually shouting, "This is not the way I want to do Agile, and maybe we'll just have to stop doing Agile altogether."
Not the greatest client in the world.
Well, he was a very passionate and quite a rather loud person, let's put it that way. Very nice temperament, yes, but, well, of course, the way of abandoning Agile altogether is also not the way, right? So we had to come up with a solution. So we said, well, without having to count every single line of code, we still want to go to a certain size, which we can also attach a certain price to, right? So we characterized standard sizes of work, if you like. So this could mean adding a button, adding some text, changing a logo, that kind of stuff on a website, you know, the small stuff, but also the larger stuff where you really develop a piece of functionality. So what we did there was to look at what are the typical things that are developed. We do that for every client, and then say, okay, what are the things you do most? How much time does it take on average? And we try to get a feeling of the work that is done, and we try to characterize typical examples. So we literally make a good list of examples. We discuss that. We see how development works, what the goals are of the company, and all that kind of stuff. Some analysis before that. And then we say, okay, we go to a vendor. This also works in shared teams. We use exactly the same mechanisms. Alex already also told you about the teams which have a shared responsibility and a shared, what's it called, bonus?
Bonus?
Bonus, right. So what we do there is that we contract basically for the standard work units, and those sometimes also vary with technology, because some technology is harder to do, right? So it takes you more time. So we also look at the type of technology which the customer has as their target technology in the architecture. And the whole system works by billing basically on the basis of completed units. So you really look at a certain number of sizes of work which have been completed, and you say, well, there's 4 of these and 2 of those. This is my bill for this month. And it works that simply. So the product owner actually kind of ticks the box when it's completed and when it's done. So how does that work in practice? As Alex already told you, we like complicated pictures. So I've cut most than half of this off. So this is just one of the categories. But what we contract is typical sizes. So here is for application development services, so actual agile development, right? Here is a list of things units, types, which we then contract. So for instance, we have something called an XS, that might be a button, and we say, well, typically in your practice, this would be about a quarter of a day maximum. So we say to the vendor, please indicate what your price would be to do a XS, an S, an M, and an L, and they, of course, in the RFP process will have all sorts of time and ability to ask questions. What do you really mean? And we contract base prices, if you like, on the types of work. So billing, as I already mentioned, is based on completed work units per billing period. And there are multiple categories. So, for instance, in the best practice model, we also say things like typified service requests, or maybe low and medium priority incident resolutions. Those can also be considered units, but this is to the preference of the client. The most important part of the model, and the most revolutionary, if you like, is the part where we go to the application development services, because that's the hardest to measure, and that's the source of the most confusion. Which doesn't mean that we don't have TNM at all anymore. For instance, what we quite often see is that clients do not just ask for flexibility and predictability, they also want some kind of standardization, some basis, right? So we call that, for instance, availability assurance or standby assurance, and this could be something like solving priority 1 incidents, because these are often done by the same people who also are in the team, which does the Agile development itself, right?
DevOps.
Yeah, exactly. So what we say here is part of the model which we contract is still T&M. We just want to have someone there who can pick up the phone if the CIO calls because his BlackBerry is not working, or his iPhone, or whatever. And they need to be there 24/7 or during office hours or whatever. So there's still a part of T&M as a basis, if you like, a stability basis in the whole model. But the whole part of the actual application development is made completely flexible, which also gives the vendor the opportunity to size accordingly, right? So if there's more work, you can provide more teams. If your quality gets better, you are allowed to provide more teams. Well, there's lots of constructions possible. So for the sake of time...
Yes, some lessons learned. We've already covered a couple of them. So one, only apply where useful. It's a bit of an, how do you say, open door statement, but it's important because there's some projects where we have a large IFRS project for a bank. We say, you know what, waterfall works perfectly fine. You know, the functionality is quite clear, etc., etc. So, okay. And as was mentioned before, there is a certain amount of maturity needed both at client as well as provider side. Shared team objectives are important. So it means, like I said, if you cannot have a situation where only the client or only the provider is hurt, or only the provider or only the client benefits, the team should benefit. This is another one. If you do this model with too many providers in your organization, it will give you a lot of overhead, whether it's the second model or the first model, so move to less providers. Some competition in the company is good, because if somebody really, for some reason, some organization screws up, would be good. And keep it simple. Not more than one provider per team if possible. There might be some specialists, but if you have 2 providers in a team, these models will be very much more difficult than if you have 1 provider per team. Those were the things we wanted to share with you this morning. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.